should see the title. So all making sure we're in the right room here. So CSPM is dead. Long live CSPM. Already introduced myself. So the agenda today is 3 parts. The first is I'm going to talk about how we got here to this place we are with modern CSPM and a little bit of the history of the security of cloud and why we need CSPM tools. Then I'll move into talking about modern CSPMs, what they have grown up to be, and how you can utilize those effectively in your cloud security programs. And then I'm going to have some talks a little bit about beyond CSPM, what you need to be thinking about for your cloud security programs. And as I said, please feel free, again, small audience chat or just break in to ask questions. I love questions. So
should we define what CSPM means?
Yes, I will. As I get there, I'm going to tell a little story and I'm going to get to what CSPM is, but we can take a pause here. So cloud security posture management, and I will talk about what that actually covers. It's an odd acronym. So just really quick. So I've been doing IT. I have to do math to figure it out, but I started off as a developer. I loved building mostly web applications. And then I switched into architecture and team leadership. And I got a little bit bored delivering project after project, and I was looking for my next opportunity. And I got a cold call from a recruiter about a company that was looking for a security architect. They couldn't find one, so they were willing to hire an architect who was interested in security and had done some things with security. So that was squarely me. I made the leap and I haven't looked back. So now since 2015, I've been a security architect. I joined Palo in 2021. Yeah, 2021 to work on the Prisma Cloud team. So, and that's what I do today. I love doing things like these, talking about security. It's been a really fulfilling challenge. I'm really glad I made the leap. I have never gotten bored since I made that change. So, a thing I really enjoy. So, we'll step into this. So, cloud and CSPM. We're gonna take a very brief journey in the Wayback Machine to figure out how we got here, what the cloud is, what CSPM is. So, but first, I want to start with a trivia question to see if we all can remember this. So, what was the first AWS offering or first AWS service? Was it EC2, CloudFront, S3, Alexa, or SQS? And I'm going to cue the Jeopardy music if anybody wants to take a guess here. Guesses? Anybody remember? Right. The first AWS offering was Alexa. Interestingly enough, Alexa Web Information Services. They later reused the name for something else, but that was the first one, followed by Simple Storage Service, Simple Queue Service, EC2, and CloudFront came much later. And I have receipts on the AWS website on their blog. So that was the date that history was made as they started to build out what would become the first public cloud service provider, and then led to, of course, Microsoft and Google and Oracle, Alibaba, and IBM following suit eventually with offering cloud services.
Kyle, you'll be happy to know, and maybe I'm the only one, but you just triggered my Alexa to talk, so good job.
I didn't even think of that. All day, my Google Nest Mini speaker on my desk will go off occasionally because I'm talking about Google and, of course, Microsoft, and all day is part of my job. So great. I'm glad I didn't trigger too much. So why the cloud? Why did this matter? So AWS, I love the phrase they use in their design principles. They wanted to eliminate undifferentiated heavy lifting. So the cloud has really democratized infrastructure and scalability. I'd say that VMware and virtualization was a step there, but there was still just a lot of lifting that you had to do if you wanted to start a company start with information technology. So it also provided easy access to the latest innovations. So an example today is, as AI is coming out, people don't need to go buy a bunch of expensive hardware to generate LLMs and other machine learning models in their data centers. That innovation is available nearly immediately as a cloud service. So it's really paved the way for a lot of innovations, and a small startup of 3 people can actually access some of this great technology that they otherwise wouldn't have able to access. So it's also spawned a whole generation of startups and innovation. So it's been spectacular. It made it easy to manage your infrastructure with APIs, which is what AWS is really famous for, is they were really strong with developers and the APIs. Later came infrastructure as code. So now, instead of racking and stacking servers, firewalls, etc., you're spinning them up virtually in the cloud, paying for only what you use. And you can also now, of course, deploy your infrastructure by just writing Terraform files or CloudFormation templates. The other great thing is, when they announced the cloud, we didn't need to worry about security anymore because the cloud took care of everything for us. I'm just kidding. They didn't. It made so many things worse, and my talk would be very short if that were true. So it created a whole new raft of security headaches as we moved forward into this technology. So I'm going to show you my part in the cloud security journey. This was me some years ago when I was learning about Azure as a security architect, and very excited as my company was making their foray into the cloud. I was very excited about this, so I'll come back to this later. But what happened with the cloud is what has happened with many other technologies and innovations along the way, which I call the information technology and security cycle of maturity. So a new capability is introduced. Security is an afterthought or not a thought at all, as this new invention is released and capability into the world. Inevitably, attacks and compromises occur. And then as they're successful and the threat actors get things that are useful and lucrative, those attacks only build over time. Then we realize we need to secure these things and do better. So security techniques, practices, and tools begin to emerge to help to fill that gap in security. And then over time, those security tools and techniques mature, and then they start to converge into platforms. So CSPM on this, and by the way, can you guys see my mouse pointer when I'm moving it on the screen?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Great. CSPM is somewhere over here. We are somewhere in the no man's land between 3 and 4, getting closer to 4. I'll touch on CNAPP toward the ends of my talk and define what that is and how that relates to CSPM. But that's kind of where we are in this cycle. Think of some examples of this cycle is, think of the internet, HTTP, web servers, email. I still remember where I was sitting and what I was doing when I got my first spam email in 1997 or so. And I was righteous with indignation, and I plowed through the headers. I did lookups on the IP addresses. I emailed the internet service provider that had come from and told them they needed to ban that user, and nothing happened. And the next day I got 2 spams. A few months later, I was getting dozens of spam emails a day. But we can follow our cycle here today with Gmail 0365 and the wealth of security products around email. I still get the occasional spam that slips through into my inbox and my phishing tests and all those things. But the problem has gotten a lot better as the capabilities for security have emerged. But back in the early days of email, I don't think the person who wrote the initial email protocol, SMTP, POP3, etc., was thinking, or the teams of people who built these things were thinking what would happen eventually. We can add Telnet to the list, which no one should be using anymore for anything. There's many more secure alternatives. So this is the cycle. The cloud is no different. So here are the security problems after we had these great cloud services. So the cloud is managed with APIs. So that means that the moat and castle of our on-prem data centers doesn't really help us anymore. The example of that is, so if I have an on-prem data center, I've got firewalls around it. Maybe I even have really good network segmentation internally. I've got dev separate from staging, separate from prod. Very difficult to break in. Most of the threats come from the outside. Some come from the inside, but you're pretty safe from the outside, right? With your firewalls and the cloud is not the case. I could have 10 layers of firewalls or virtual firewalls, as it were, around my cloud perimeter. But if I leak an API key to manage virtual machines or EC2 instances in AWS on GitHub, it doesn't matter how many firewalls I had. The threat actor is inside my EC2 instance, and they've got command and control, and those firewalls didn't matter. So it's harder. The other thing is the rate of new services coming out. I'll show you an infographic later where even just AWS for many, many years were releasing 2 to 3 new cloud services per month. Those were new services to secure, new services with new security risks. Frequently default settings weren't secure. As if we've learned nothing, right, in all these years that secure defaults, we're getting better. AWS, Microsoft, GCP, the other clouds are getting better and better about that, but frequently hardened security settings still aren't the default. The other piece too is that we know less about securing new things. Like, I'm very familiar with how to harden an operating system and the resources I need to go to do that and the tools to go do that. But when it's a new thing, that security awareness just isn't there in the people that are building the things and the cloud services. The other thing that cloud introduced is what's called the shared responsibility model. So back to my prior point about, well, I don't need to worry about anything security wise in the cloud because Amazon or Microsoft or Google is taking care of it for me, is actually a pretty common belief among those who aren't that security versed in the cloud. And it is true to a degree, right? Amazon protects their infrastructure. They protect their infrastructure from DDoS. They make sure that their services, their virtual machines, their hypervisors that are hosting all the customers, they make sure that those are patched, those are secure. They make sure their data centers are secure, but that's where their responsibility ends. They can do everything exactly right, and I can still deploy a publicly exposed Azure storage account that has credit card numbers in it. And even though Microsoft has secured everything that they're responsible for, where my responsibility is, I can misconfigure it and create security risk. Compliance. A lot of compliance standards prior to the cloud make sense. They were only written to make sense for on-prem deployed resources. So as companies started choosing to put things in the cloud, it created a lot of confusion around like, well, how do I comply with PCI DSS or how do I comply with NIST in the cloud? And this was before we started to get cloud specific or cloud customized compliance standards and technical hardening standards. So nobody really knew what to do. We didn't have CIS there. And then management would start asking questions. How is our cloud security? In the early days, I don't even know how to answer that question. The security tools didn't exist. And also, how's our security in the cloud? And I would respond, well, I've got clouds, plural. Most companies that I've worked with in my job and over the years are in at least 2 public clouds. I'd say 95% of them. Many of them not by choice. It was an acquisition. It was a development team that insisted on having a certain feature in a certain cloud, even though they standardized on another, or even shadow IT, because it's a pretty low bar to be able to start to deploy stuff in the cloud, and you can pay for a cloud account with a corporate credit card. So a lot of issues. And then this is me when I realized what was happening. My job as a security architect. I was very sad. It was very hard to secure the cloud. But then we had an answer: cloud security posture management. So the idea was, and I sorry to keep picking on S3 buckets, all cloud services can have security issues. That was one of the earliest cloud services. It was one of the first places where you started to see breaches and exposures in the news, people leaving S3 buckets and objects exposed. So not picking on Amazon or S3, but it's a good example that most people can identify with. So the idea was, well, my developers in this, some companies had automation to deploy cloud resources, some didn't, and they did do and still do to a degree click ops. Someone is clicking in the Amazon console, the Microsoft Azure console to deploy things. How can we make sure that those things being deployed are secure? So the basic premise of cloud security posture management is it's a service. Typically it's software as a service. I think originally there were on-prem versions. Typically it's software as a service. You give the service access to read your cloud footprint. And what it does is it goes through, it finds your deployed cloud assets, their configuration, and then evaluates security hardening policies against what it's seeing in your cloud footprint. So for example, it might go, a cloud security posture management tool, and I'm talking about the early tools, might go once a day or once a week or once a month or whatever it would be, go pull a list of every S3 bucket, and then go pull the configuration for each individual S3 bucket. Then it would look at that configuration, compare it to a list of security hardening best practices, and then output somewhere, either to a file, to a ticketing system, to, I don't know what, a database somewhere. And it would let you know, of your 80 S3 buckets, I found 5 that are publicly exposed. So now we started to get visibility. So instead of having to click through the cloud console and manually check each S3 bucket to make sure that it wasn't publicly exposed, now I had a tool that would automate that and go check it for me. So this started off through a lot of open source efforts to build this, which did run into problems. There might be good open source offerings now. I'm not really plugged into that space that much. But the other thing it did is it also gives us the inventory of what we have in the cloud. This can be hard to see if you've ever spent time in a cloud console, particularly if you're in more than one cloud, to just be able to get on the screen a simple list and answer the question, show me everything that I have deployed in Azure. It's hard to answer. So CSPM tools started to give you that single pane of glass to answer that question. As I mentioned, they also created multi-cloud visibility on a single pane of glass. So AWS, GCP, and Microsoft were the big 3 that most CSPM tools supported initially and still today. Also, the cool thing is now I can start to answer higher level questions. So security programs, to be well run, eventually evolve to the point where they're run at least partially by metrics. So I'm measuring, what are my risk scores? What is my tolerance, so that I can know week by week, month by month, as I'm looking at the overall security of a thing from a management level and a governance level. Am I getting better? Am I getting worse? Is my AWS cloud, is the overall number of security issues within tolerance, meaning it's low enough, let's say 98% of assets complying with all security policies, or have I drifted down to 90%? Why? What is my plan to go fix that? So we started to get some metrics and reporting that could give us some useful visibility to be able to manage the life cycle and trends of security. Next up is compliance. So as the compliance standards started to come into play and we understood how cloud security settings mapped to both existing compliance standards as well as upcoming new compliance standards, like eventually the CSA CCM, for example, given we're on a CSA call here. NIST has the CSF. So a lot of additional things. And then CIS has released benchmarks for GCP, AWS, and a tremendous number of things. So CSPM tools started to say, well, as long as I'm checking these things and I have this data about passing and failing of security policies, I'll map those policy checks into like, how does a publicly exposed S3 bucket, does it violate a PCI DSS tenant or requirement? The answer is it can, right? So I map those in, and now I can start to get compliance visibility on how compliant I am with standards that I need to comply with. CSPM was a really good start, early CSPM, and actually I'll take a breath and a sip of water. Did anybody have any questions so far? Does what CSPM is make sense?
Nothing in the chat right now, Kyle, but makes sense to me.
Okay, cool, great. So as with any early tool, we had some problems. So this is the infographic I was promising you about, and it'll be relevant in a second. I sorted this, and I have the source in the slide deck. Someone went through the effort of going through all the AWS blog posts of when they announced services to general availability. And you can see there was a year they announced and launched 39 new services. Like, that is insane. Keeping up with that, securing that is, and it's also exciting from the level of innovation and what it made available to people. So this was a problem with early CSPM tools. They simply did not keep up with this. They would stick with their storage accounts, their EC2 instances, their network constructs in the cloud. But beyond that, the coverage was very spotty, and it definitely did not keep up with new services. So if you wanted to use a new service, early CSPM typically would take years before it could help you. Early CSPM was limited to configuration only. We'll talk in a little bit about more of the things that CSPM covers today. Lack of context. We just had, and a lack of prioritization led to massive alert fatigue because we're having tens of thousands of alerts if you have a sizable cloud footprint. There were scale issues. Many early CSPM tools couldn't scale to large cloud footprints, but we also had scalability issues with people and processes and usage of the tool. How do I scale to work with teams to resolve 10,000 issues without prioritization, without integrations into other tools? Inconsistent CSP support. Most CSPM tools are really good about supporting AWS, or really good about supporting AWS, and then eventually they'd add the same feature or coverage for Azure, and then eventually GCP, and typically in that order, which is still somewhat true today, but it was really easy to find CSPMs that had really good AWS coverage, but not so much for Azure and GCP. Lastly, deep identity analysis, scanning for vulnerabilities were not part of early CSPM. So we just didn't have that information available at the time. So in short,
Hey, Kyle,
yeah.
there's a question in the chat, which maybe will be good for you to defer to later when you talk about the future, but I'll put it on your context.
Okay.
Harvey asked, how does this work with orchestration?
I'm actually going to talk about that in a little later.
I thought
so
you might.
I will come to that. Yes. The answer in early CSPMs is it effectively didn't. So today CSPMs do. So, but in short, early CSPMs were too noisy, and of course they only detected problems. They didn't prevent them. They didn't prevent breaches. They didn't prevent attacks, right? So hence early CSPM is dead. By itself, it's not enough to secure your cloud environment. So we'll move into the next generation of CSPM, which is what we're squarely in today after a few years of innovation. There are many. I do work and represent and help customers use one of those modern CSPM tools today, but there are many others. Many features are shared. You'll have differences between different CSPM tools, which I'll talk about your CSPM criteria later. But what's different with modern CSPM? So a couple things. So one is more signals. So most CSPMs today have CIEM, which is Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management, which does a deep analysis of how all those roles and policies and grants and denies in the cloud end up resulting in what we call net effective permissions for each identity. So what permissions do identities have? Are they using them? Should they have them? Are they risky permissions? Most CSPMs today also offer what we call agentless scanning for vulnerabilities and hardening. And this is really key because that's an important data point when I'm looking at the risk of like my virtual machines, my serverless functions, my containers even, or my container clusters. What are the vulnerabilities and hardening issues within those deployed workloads? And agentless is a very easy way without, well, it's agentless. So you're not deploying agents, you're giving your CSPM tools some extra permissions, and it goes and does a highly efficient snapshotting process to not interrupt your workloads and provides you really rich vulnerability data, which I'll talk about DSPM a little bit later, but actually looking at what's in those storage accounts, doing deeper analysis on how they're exposed. An S3 bucket that contains graphics for a website isn't a risk if it's public, but an S3 bucket that has an object that overrode the settings to be public and has healthcare information, that is a much bigger risk. But what all of these helped give us then is more context, which then led to one, better prioritization. CSPM tools can now tell you like, hey, these 10 EC2 instances over here, go look at those first because the risk, the aggregate risk that those represent is really bad because we now have all these security signals that we're putting together in context. The other piece is that attacks and breaches rarely happen as the result of one specific vulnerability or failure of a security control. They are typically many things put together, which I'll call attack graphs. Um, Prisma Cloud calls it an attack path. Microsoft's Azure security tools call it an attack path as well. And what this is combinations of vulnerabilities that yield greater risk than any one of the vulnerabilities put together. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in a moment. Better metrics. I don't care just how many alerts I have open or how many issues are currently open and present in my environment. I want to know the trend over time. I want to know which ones are critical. I want to know which ones apply to the CIS benchmark that I'm targeting, or the NIST or the ISO framework that I'm targeting, or high trust or HIPAA. So we're able to get a lot better metrics out of modern CSPM tools as those tool makers have come to understand what customers are using, how they need to customize it. Most CSPMs today have much better coverage of those cloud services that exist, and they're also much faster to be able to ingest and scan new cloud resources that are deployed. So this is also very important. So you can innovate, you can use the new services, and your CSPM will be keeping up with your usage and allow you to secure those services or monitor them for security. Lastly, we have much better and more robust compliance and reporting. I'll show you an example later. And here we're going to get to that question. So CSPMs today typically have pretty simple remediation capabilities in them. So if it's an S3 bucket and it's public, most CSPM tools, if you want to turn it on and give the CSPM tool permissions, it can flip the public access block to false for you if you want to do that. But that's very simple. A lot of incident responses are much more complicated than that. And that's why we have SOAR tools today, security orchestration and response tools. So most CSPMs today have out-of-box integration to SIM tools like Splunk, integrations to Phantom, Cortex XOR, which used to be Demisto. There's any number of SOAR tools in the market. So it's typically not the job of CSPMs, and I actually appreciate this, to become an orchestration engine in and of themselves in response. But most today are good citizens and provide you that way to integrate into those orchestration tools. And many orchestration tools actually provide out-of-box playbooks to use as a starting template in response to getting alerts from your CSPM tools. So did that answer was that the orchestration question that was asked earlier? Or does that answer your question rather, more importantly?
Not seen any feedback from Harvey on that one, but felt like you, yeah, like that you connected
Okay.
the dots.
Good. All right. So onward. I'm aware I'm going to go a little faster with time here. So also modern CSPMs do a really good job at detecting a certain class of threats. So many CSPMs today can ingest either your user audit logs from your cloud service provider, and some can do both your NetFlow logs of your aggregate network traffic, like this device connected to this IP on the network, and they exchanged 100 kilobytes and everybody was happy. So that data about what's actually happening in your cloud footprint is ingested by modern CSPMs, and then when I say speaking of my tool, but many CSPMs do this, they actually look at that data using machine learning, static behavior profiles, et cetera, looking for signs of threat events that someone should look at, like a SOC team. So that threat detection from CSPMs is actually really important because it's a layer of visibility outside of the individual servers and individual containers into the user behavior on your cloud footprint, as well as the network traffic between devices. And that's something that, using an EDR, other endpoint security tools, they're really good at seeing what's happening on the individual workload, but not what's happening across the footprint. And that's where CSPMs can really shine in doing threat detection. So I'm going to step into what a modern CSPM looks like and some of the capabilities. So feel free to ask questions. I'll probably buzz through this, but just to give you an idea, if you haven't seen a CSPM tool before or haven't seen one lately, because they've really come a long way, even just in the last 2 or 3 years. So I'm looking at context for an EC2 instance in a demo environment. So this is intentionally vulnerable. But I'm going to provide you some screenshots to show you some of that context we can get just about this one virtual machine in a cloud footprint. So here you can see we have a lot of details. What operating system is it running? This one happens to be part of a Kubernetes cluster. We get a lot of details. What cloud account is it in? As we move forward, we can see all the tags on the asset. We can see vulnerabilities coming from that agentless scanning, so CVEs. We can see the CSPM configuration alerts. Many CSPMs today also can ingest and augment their data from other sources. So AWS Guard Duty does certain types of threat detection. So some CSPMs can ingest guard duty data and augment their threat data with the data from the other tools. Some CSPMs can even help you understand and identify and categorize, hey, this server is part of this business application, the front end for National Bank in this demo environment. Here is the person or team who owns it. It is a business critical application, versus a small internal reporting tool that someone uses once a month. So having that context is so important. Some other stuff as we journey down this, I can see all of the security findings the CSPM has found against this asset, including detailed permission analysis. I can see the vulnerabilities. Here we've got actually the containerd container runtime, which is built with Go, I believe, is using a Go package compiled into the binary. And this tool is telling me, hey, you have an old version with a really critical CVE present. I get a summary of my results up here. I also get that deep permission analysis. So it doesn't matter how it got it. The tool can actually tell me which role gave it every permission, but I can see the net effective permissions of what this EC2 instance is capable of doing. And it's capable of doing a lot. If I were able to scroll down, I'm not, with S3 buckets, which could be bad. And lastly, some CSPM tools also give you a detailed change history of every asset that they're tracking. So here we can see the tool tracked that the configuration of the asset was changed, and I could click this and see the delta view of what configuration was actually changed. But it's also, again, with that context piece, it's folding in when it's detecting those vulnerabilities with agentless, so I can have a detailed timeline of what's actually happening with this asset. Next, I'll talk about attack path. So this is also, we can call it an attack graph or also I like to call it a pivot chain when I'm talking about it sometimes. So with this, I'll use the Capital One breach, and not to throw throw rocks in my glass house, because cloud security is hard. Capital One is well known for innovation in the cloud space, and they generally do a good job, but a specific combination of vulnerabilities resulted in a breach. It was, I believe, a misconfigured or vulnerable WAF instance, allowed them to get command and control on an EC2 virtual machine. The virtual machine was using an older AWS metadata management service that has since been deprecated but is still available. So it was using that old service that let the attacker see what roles and privileges that EC2 instance had and assume one of those roles. And that role that they chose had access to a tremendous number of S3 buckets, and not only access to it, but access to decrypt the contents. So with that, then I think it was maybe an S3 bucket that had a years of credit card applications archived. They were able to get that data and then exfiltrate it outside of Capital One's environment. So if any one of those things hadn't been true, for example, if that EC2 instance didn't have over permissive access to S3 buckets it shouldn't have had access to, the attack would have stopped or would have been much less in magnitude. If the WAF hadn't had the vulnerability, if it was using the new metadata service, which doesn't let you do that, by the way. If any one of those things hadn't been true, the attack wouldn't have been as successful. So modern CSPMs are going to show you and alert you where those attack paths exist. So this is an attack path that is similar to what I just described happened to Capital One. So here we have a CSPM alert that's showing this EC2 instance is exposed to the internet. The tool analyzed every network layer and configuration and said, yep, this EC2 instance, e-billing demo, is exposed to the internet. Also, if I were to expand this, it would tell me it's running the old instance metadata service. The CIEM analysis shows me that that EC2 instance has this role, and that role has a policy that gives it permission to access every S3 bucket in that cloud account. That's a wild card. It's not very clear there. So this EC2 instance, as opposed to another EC2 instance with this same CSPM vulnerability of misconfiguration that might not be exposed to the internet and or might not have access to S3 buckets, that vulnerability on those EC2 instances, it isn't as important. It isn't as risky. But here, the presence of these risks together makes a critical risk that needs attention and needs resolution. Any questions on attack paths and graphs?
In chat, Harvey asked a question that's probably similar to what you just presented, but do you have any knowledge of the attack path on the SolarWinds stuff from a few years ago? And if this would have had a similar
Yeah,
feature set would have had bearing there?
that's a great question. That was a supply chain attack. So the attackers were able to infiltrate their CI/CD pipelines and actually inject malicious code into the final SolarWinds compiled, package of software that all their customers were installing. So that's a different area of security than CSPM. That's CI/CD pipeline security, and there are products today, and some of them are part of CNAPP solutions. Again, I'll touch on CNAPP at the end. So security tools do have started to come into existence for that, and some are part of CSPM, or sorry, part of broader cloud security suites. It's not technically part of CSPM, but tools exist to help with that today. But that would be another talk. It's a great question. So on the topic of prioritization, modern CSPM tools are doing a much better job. So here we can see up at the top, I have a critical vuln, and this is an attack path. So this is, I have an EC2 instance exposed to the internet. Actually, it's working for Azure and AWS. I have something exposed to the internet, and I found the original log4shell vulnerability here. I remember that number very well from the trenches, 44228. So that's the most important risk that we're seeing here. Also, in the threat detection department, the CSPM, because it's monitoring net flow traffic, it can see that one or more servers is communicating with an IP that's known to be malicious based on threat intelligence. So that's a potential security incident or event that needs attention. Down here, still high, but I have an EC2 instance that's exposed to the internet. But note, this isn't as risky as a server exposed to the internet that also has a critical CVE. So this really helps me as a practitioner and as an organization using the tool know what I should be prioritizing. I also get kind of in that top 10, top 5 category. Like if I were to go as a security architect or a SOC team or whatever, if I were to go attack the most critical risk, the low hanging fruit, modern CSPM tools give you dashboards to tell you, hey, top 5, go look at this right now. Again, I would say a mature security program can't be built off top 5 risks, right? It's a good place to start when you first get visibility into your cloud security if you haven't had it before. But operationally, fixing the top 5, another 5 will come to take their place, and the attackers don't go after the top 5 every time, right? But it is a really good place to start for your initial visibility and to kind of close some of those biggest gaps of security in your cloud footprint. Lastly, I'll talk briefly just about compliance frameworks. So this is an example of a tool. It has a ton of out-of-box compliance frameworks pre-mapped. So it's checking PCI 3.2, PCI 4 is further down on the list beyond the screenshot. I've got metrics. With this tool, I can generate PDF reports. With most of them, you can, that auditors love, that goes compliance requirement by requirement. Shows how many of your assets are complying with those requirements. So it's very useful for both the actual audit cycles, but it's also useful on a continual basis to make sure that your compliance is trending in the right direction and that you're not going to get surprise findings during your next audit cycle. So now that we've seen all the capabilities, you're asking yourself, does my organization, do I need a CSPM tool? And my response is, are you in the cloud? If you are in the cloud, you absolutely, unequivocally need to have some form of CSPM helping to monitor your cloud footprint. It is table stakes, basic, and I do want to emphasize this. If you have a presence in the public cloud, you really do need a CSPM. You have many options in a CSPM tool, but you need to have something. It's a really important piece of a cloud security program. Pro tip, don't build your own CSPM. It's really hard. It's really hard to scale. And also, it's not just the effort to build it. And yes, there have been some companies that have done this, and I've seen it. It's a big effort up front to get, it's hard to get it right. It's hard to build all the security policies yourself. And also it's an ongoing effort. So as AWS and Azure release those new services and your company wants to innovate, you basically need a full-time team of people to keep up with the new services, the security settings, what are the best practices, because CIS doesn't keep up with that, right? So like cryptography, web session management, it's a bad idea to build your own. But if you're in the market for a CSPM, some things to look at and things to consider. Make sure you understand your organization's cloud roadmap and your security requirements. What are your compliance requirements? What is your risk tolerance? What type of data, what type of applications are you running in the cloud? These all have an impact on what CSPM you choose. So look for how well it covers services, and namely the services that you use, but also how well it and quickly it covers new services. Look for compliance benchmarks, make sure it has what you need, and that they're kept up to date as new versions are released. Look for how long the tool takes to detect certain types of configuration issues and threats. So some are 24 hours, some are longer, some are minutes, and they vary by what things they're detecting. Lastly, make sure you check scale. If you've got a really big cloud footprint, make sure you try the tool, make sure it actually can scale to do that. There are a few CSPMs out there that don't really scale that well for larger cloud footprints, but they work fine for small ones. Look for those modern CSPM features that are all part of the platform. So the identity piece, the agentless vulnerability scanning, data security posture management scanning, And of course, that attack graph support is really important to help prioritize. Look for the integrations. The tool by itself, unless it can work with your ecosystem of tools and reach out to, say, SOAR tools, to your SIMs, it's just going to be another pane of glass that nobody looks at, or a few people look at. To be useful, it really needs to be able to integrate into your ticketing system. So your ServiceNow, your Jira, Splunk, right? So make sure the tool can integrate with the tools that you're using so that you can leverage it effectively. Also look to see, does it have good basic reporting? Most CSPM tools don't want to be a giant customizable reporting tool. They have good reports, but if you need heavy customization, most of them have APIs and extract capabilities that let you take that data out into your Power BI or your Tableau to do the custom reporting and advanced reporting that you want to do. And lastly, and this is so important, make sure that when you pick a CSPM tool, you're picking one that not only meets what your needs are now, but they align with your roadmap and your future requirements for cloud security, because a good cloud security program does not happen overnight. It takes time. It's a years long march to maturity. So you need to make sure that you're not buying a tool that's just going to meet your needs right now, but in a year or two, it's not going to scale. It's not going to have the capabilities that you want. And you're going to have to go either replace it, which is a lot of work, or buy additional tools that don't integrate with that tool to meet your future needs. So again, you can't predict the future, but make sure that you're picking a tool that's capable of growing with you, which will save you a lot of heartache down the road as you implement your cloud security program. So using CSPM in your cloud security program, there's several key roles that it plays. So one is continual reporting and metrics on your cloud security posture. It's really important. Use it to detect policy violations, both of out-of-box standards and any organizational policies that you have. Make sure you're using it for that. Use it to detect the worst risks and issues that need resolution, and that it helps you prioritize those. It can detect, like I said, there's a certain class of threats that CSPM is really important and vital at detecting that endpoint solutions don't. So utilize it for that. Integrate it with your SIM. Engage your SOC team so they know how to use the tool to help investigate and get forensics out about what's happening in the cloud. You can also use it and should use it to assure the effectiveness of your security program. Watch those trend lines. Are things going the wrong way? Are they going the right way? What is your next step in maturity to improve that stuff? CSPM is good for that. And lastly, audit and compliance reporting, even though some people consider it boring, I find it interesting most of the time, is very important. Most organizations have many compliance standards that they need to comply with and they're beholden to. And lastly, use it to be able to investigate and explore your cloud footprint. Architects love CSPMs because it gives them visibility about what's there, how it's talking to each other. SOC teams utilize it heavily, CSPMs, to investigate, like I showed you, all that context just on that one virtual machine. So if they're investigating an incident, it's really useful to be able to go see that, the change history, et cetera, what application it's part of. Quick hit here, and I see I'm kind of running out of time. I'm going to go maybe just a couple minutes over, but I'm very close to the end. So it's also important to operationalize it. Yes.
We're
Is there a
not
question?
worried about you finishing right at 7. You can
Oh,
continue.
okay. Great. Maybe I won't talk quite so fast. Thank you. So with any security tool, you can't, back in the day when things were physical appliances, you would rack them, and then it was another security tool that had blinky lights, but nobody was looking at what it was detecting, right? So if the joke was, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, if a security tool alerts to a security issue but nobody's watching it, did it happen? Well, yes, it did. Right. So operationalizing is very important. And this is something I have practical experience with. A SaaS CSPM tool can become another blinky light appliance, right? If you don't have a plan and goals and metrics that you're shooting for, A lot of companies will fall down here, and it literally becomes just another source of alerts that nobody's looking at and nobody's doing anything with. So take the time. Every CSPM tool lets you tune it, configure it. Maybe that policy isn't quite exactly right for your organization and you need to make a customized version. Maybe you're targeting the CSA CCM, so maybe you prioritize policy violations that apply to that compliance standard first. So prioritize based on your organization requirements. Um, Make sure that you integrate what the CSPM is doing into your people and processes, right? So metrics, procedures, make sure people are trained. The people who need to use it are trained. You have roles and responsibilities or a RACI for that. I mentioned this earlier, integrated into your other tools. So into your reporting tools, send the security incident alerts off to your SIM so your SOC team can go look at it, send the infrastructure configuration issues to whatever cloud teams need to see them and action them. So you can't depend on people to log into, we have so many security tools right today. You can't depend on people logging into that tool every day to go check what the new issues are. So make sure you're doing integration into the tools that they're already using. Lastly, and this is harder than it sounds, make sure that the CSPM is seeing your whole cloud footprint. Like I mentioned, things get real complicated if your company buys another company and maybe they had an AWS organization or an Azure tenant that you didn't know about, or maybe that separate division or line of business had something. So there are tools for that, by the way. Attack surface management is that category of tools that can scour the internet for signs of things that are tied to your company that are hosted in the cloud and otherwise, and then let you know if your CSPM is actually monitoring those and protecting those. And it's shocking how many, I've worked with a number of companies that keep finding additional cloud exposures that they didn't know about. And lastly, as a pro tip, it's really easy to Google to find the way that attackers use development cloud accounts, development identities, and credentials as an initial pivot point for attacks. I've had a lot of customers that want to, well, I don't want to pay to secure my development Azure subscriptions, but I say you should probably prioritize those because developers frequently have elevated privileges and are very pivot rich targets for attackers. So make sure everything you deploy in the cloud, whether you call it development or not, is technically production. That's a difference in the cloud versus on-prem. So make sure that you're treating those with the same security and CSPM monitoring that you do your production accounts. But lastly, we still have a problem. You've got the CSPM, you've picked a good one, you've operationalized it, you've driven your security metrics into a really good place, your intolerance, but something's missing. So I'll explain this with a parallel topic. So vulnerabilities. If I buy a vulnerability scanning tool, so I buy Qualys, Rapid7, whatever, Tenable, I'm scanning my footprint and my servers, and every time I find a critical vulnerability that's more than 30 days old, which is an organization policy a lot of organizations have, I create a ticket, I send it to the server team. If that's the only way we're managing vulnerabilities, nobody is ever going to keep up. And that's because vulnerability scanning by itself is only scanning what you've already deployed after the fact. The risk is already there and you're never going to keep up because you're not stopping the onslaught. As opposed to just vulnerability scanning, if you have a vulnerability management program, and let's say part of that, a good vulnerability management program is you create a patching policy. And then your infrastructure teams, your Microsoft Windows teams, they have a practice based on that every month that after Patch Tuesday, they start with a ring deployment to the servers and they have a regular cadence. Then your vulnerability scanning, instead of being the driver to patch your servers, becomes an assurance and detection mechanism that makes sure that your patching program is working, your proactive patching program. It's very much the same with cloud. CSPM is only a detective control. It is not going to stop risks from occurring in the first place. It is not going to stop those attacks. It's going to help you reduce your risk and reduce the likelihood of an attack. But by the time your CSPM sees a risk, it is deployed and out there. It is not a preventative control. So this is where it, and I'm going to be closing here in a minute, where CNAPPs come in. So cloud native application protection platforms. So this is basically CSPM is a vital part of CNAPP, but CNAPP solutions add a lot more. They add broad left to right detection and prevention for your cloud applications. Some examples of that: they shift left. All those Terraform files and CloudFormation templates that you're deploying to deploy your cloud infrastructure, you can scan them. You can scan them before you deploy them. You can catch those misconfigurations. You can scan your Docker files for vulnerabilities before you deploy that container into a dev, staging, or production environment. On the right side, runtime, cloud workload protection, which is not part of CSPM, but many solutions, CNAPPs offer CSPM and cloud workload protection. This is protecting those endpoints, those serverless function, those containers, those servers down at the runtime level, the file system, the network traffic within the host, within the device, the container, et cetera, looking at the process activity. And those can actually actively prevent attacks, tell you that they thwarted something, but they will prevent it rather than telling you that, hey, something bad happened an hour ago or 15 minutes ago. You should go look at it. Then it takes time to respond. It takes time to block the attack. Cloud workload protection can actually stop attacks, and that's a part of many modern CNAPPs today. We can also shift even more left than your CI/CD pipelines, and there's IDE extensions that can check for Docker file vulnerabilities. It can check for Terraform file vulnerabilities and tell the developer right when they're writing the code that they have a security issue. DSPM is evolving. I had that under CSPM. It's also under CNAPP, telling me not only that my S3 bucket is exposed, but telling me what kind of data I have in it helps me understand where my risk is and honestly where it's not. And lastly, CNAPPs, good CNAPPs integrate all of this visibility from the left to the right to give you full context and traceability. So here's what you get. I have CSPM, CEIM, which is the identity analysis, and cloud workload protection put together into an attack path. So this is a bigger attack path than we saw, right? So I've got the exposure, I've got the over permissive access to S3 buckets, I've got that misconfiguration, but here my CSPM itself is doing threat detection. It's like, hey, your network traffic from this EC2 instances is way higher than normal. You should look at that. But also, with cloud workload protection, I detected and or blocked a code injection attack, a SQL injection attack. So now my attack path, which is critical, has a lot more signal data, and it's actively detecting and or blocking, if I have it turned on, certain types of attacks. So I can do a lot more when I have all these next gen features as part of a CNAPP. The other thing it gives me with that full left to right visibility, this misconfiguration using that old metadata service, the V1 service, I could click this, it'll run that one command for remediation or send it off to a SOAR tool to fix that server right now, but the next time I push my Terraform file, the issue is going to come back. Well, if I'm using a CNAPP suite, some CNAPPs can now trace that and know that I know that this EC2 instance came from this GitHub repository, and from this file and this line in the file is where this configuration element is insecure. And this fix and code button in this case would submit a pull request all the way back to that GitHub repo that contains the fix to kind of what we say is fix this forever. Manual fix here, and this tool will actually take you to the GitHub repo, to the file and the line to show you where the issue is if you want to fix it manually. So we call that code to cloud visibility. And it lets me see things in a full lifecycle view. So here I can see the trend of vulnerabilities that I'm finding in my version control repositories. I can see my container registries and my images in the deployment phase. So this is a CBDR. And then finally, I can see what are my issues now at runtime. So I can see my visibility is now much broader than just CSPM, which would have been looking over here at a few things over on the right-hand side. So with that, I will give you one final word of wisdom seen across many customers that I work with, and including my own experience over the years before I came to Palo to work with different customers. And that is that tools themselves do not secure your organization. The best tools money can buy without a solid plan, people, and processes will not secure your organization. So pick a CSPM, pick one that meets your needs, but please have a plan, operationalize it, use it. Another blinky light tool is not just having it in your possession. I know you know this, but it's worth repeating because I see it repeated over and over. It's not going to make you secure if you're not actually utilizing the capability and making it part of a good program. People are using it and you have processes around it. So with that, some summary points here. CSPM is a vital part of a cloud security program. My humble opinion, you have to have one if you're in the cloud. It provides critical ongoing monitoring of your security posture and individual risks. It gives you very important reporting, and it's assuring that what you're launching into your production cloud is secure. CSPM also detects, as I described, certain types of threats that those agents and endpoint solutions can't see. So that's also important for your security program. But lastly, CSPM should not be the only cloud security tool in your program. So it's a vital part. Modern CSPMs do a lot better, but without all the other stuff around it that I talked about in the prior slides, you can't really have a good, complete cloud security programming capability. So CSPM is a healthy part of a balanced cloud security program, in summary. And that concludes my presentation.
Yay.
You're not going to harken back and say long live CSPM?
Long live CSPM in its new form as part of CNAPP. Yes, that would have been a nice closing. I missed my opportunity there.
So, hey, Kyle, thank you very much. Awesome presentation. Do you have time to field
Absolutely.
a few questions, or
Absolutely,
do you have a hard stop?
I don't have a stop time, so I'm happy to hang out.
One of them, before I forget it, is are you willing to share your contact info? I'm sure people can find you on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any other contact info you want to verbally put out there.
Yep. I will share my contact info.
Okay. While you're doing that, if you're willing to share out the slides or the link here, I could send them out to the group afterwards. If for any reason you can't do that, we understand. But
no, it's great. I'll export this and I'll send that to you for distribution.
Okay. And before we get to the questions, just in case people do start dropping off, I posted a link in the chat. We are going to start, as I mentioned earlier, start posting videos of these sessions up to a new YouTube channel we created for our local CSA. This will be our first one. So I say I'm going to do it. Hopefully I don't screw it up. So I will send out that as part of an email follow-up to the group when we're done here. And again, one last thing, I mentioned it earlier, but we are asking for folks to fill out a survey just about the effectiveness of this group, what we could do to better serve you, sessions, topics, speakers you might recommend, et cetera, et cetera. That link I just pasted in the chat. Hopefully that works from everybody. You may see it come across in an email if you haven't already in the near future too. You obviously only need to fill it out once. We're just kind of beta testing it on the group that we have in front of us here today, since you're the folks who actually showed up. So let's see. With that, Kyle, I will flash back to stuff that's in the chat, but if anybody wants to come off of mute, you could feel free to ask too. I'm gonna actually start with some of the more recent ones because I think a few that were in the chat actually got covered by Kyle over time. So if anybody wants to reinforce one they asked earlier, please feel free to pull it back out there. But one was, do you see a future in CSPM and CNAPP in the implementation of AI?
Yes, absolutely. That's a growing field and capability in the CSPM space. So we're going to call it, I think it's been coined AI posture management or AI service posture management. So many cloud CSPM or CNAPP solutions either have that or adding it. So one of the things you can look at, right? Like, so the CSPM I work on, we support a number of AI services, but one of the features we're going to introduce is those just show up as regular services right next to your S3 buckets, et cetera. They're going to be categorized as AI. There's going to be different dashboards to cover AI services because a lot of organizations want to pay attention to specifically AI and some of the security risk that it presents, because there's some different stuff about that, right? When you look at machine learning models, the data going into them, do you want to control and allow? Most cloud services organizations are pretty open about their developers starting to use, but many have specific and more strict policies. And if they don't, they might need it, right, for AI services. So yes, AI is becoming a growing area of specificity within CSPM tools, and you'll start to see a lot more launches with that across the different vendors that have CSPM.
Awesome. I'll just acknowledge a question, but I don't think you need to answer it. Frank earlier asked, is there a distinction between CNAPP and CSPM? But I think your latter slides kind of talked about the differences and also where
Yep.
they can complement each other. Earlier, Stephen asked, and I think this is when you had up when the tooling was showing like, hey, here's 4 different vulnerabilities. Here's a server that's internet exposed. Here's one for Log4j. He asked, what if the EC2 isn't a private VPC only reachable by VPN? Would it decrease the score?
Yes. Yep, or it wouldn't show as one of those critical attack paths at all because it's not directly exposed to the internet. So
That's
yeah, and
awesome.
that context is so important, right? Because
Okay.
not the same vulnerability on 2 different servers can have a totally different level of risk.
I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but somebody raised their hand in the session. So Anupam is how I say your name.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
you'd like to chime in.
You're right on, Matthew. So great session, Kyle. Enjoyed it. I have a
Thank you.
couple of questions, and hopefully the answers will be
Yeah.
quick. So one of the things that you mentioned, one of the screens that you showed had a display of a vulnerability, and then you later on talked of scanning tools like Qualys and Nessus. So are you is the CSPM where is it getting those vulnerabilities from? I mean, is it scanning? Does it have built-in scanners, or how does it detect that?
Yeah, the quick answer can be both. So most CSPM tools today ship with both agentless and some ship with also agent-based vulnerability scanning, so they can get the vulnerabilities that way. I know of at least one tool, the tool that I work with, can also ingest AWS GuardDuty, Inspector, Tenable, and Qualys findings to provide those CVEs. So some people will, so I've got Qualys deployed everywhere, it's scanning all my virtual machines in the cloud. I don't want to deploy agentless or agent-based scanning because I'm already doing it, but can you ingest that and use that data in those attack paths? And the answer is some tools can. And,
Okay,
and I'm
that's
and I'm
great.
seeing a growing trend towards that, by the way, because you might not want the entire CNAPP. You might not want to license the whole thing. You might have coverage that you don't want to break ties with. If you're using Qualys on-prem and in the cloud, you might not want to use X CSPM tool just for vulnerabilities in the cloud and have it be different. So yeah, the ability to I'm seeing platforms open up more and able to take signals from other security tools to incorporate those into that risk prioritization. So you'll be seeing more of that too in the market.
Okay, that helps. And my second question, Kyle, is does like a CSPM tool also like capable of detecting drift in configurations and all that?
Yes, that's a major part of CNAPP. I didn't show it today. But given that traceability, right, that the CNAPP knows that this deployed EC2 instance actually came all the way from this Terraform file over here. So if you go manually modify, just for the rest of the folks on the call, what drift detection here is, if an admin goes and manually modifies the configuration of that EC2 instance, now it doesn't match what was in the Terraform file that deployed it, that's drift. Drift is bad, right? Because for several reasons. One is what you deployed isn't what you thought anymore. And also, when I deployed the Terraform again, it'll wipe out that change and put it back to match the Terraform file. So drift can be dangerous in a couple different directions. So yes, some CNAPP solutions, which include CNAPP, but include that code security, traceability, and tools, can let you know and alert you when you have drift and give you options to fix it, either by modifying Terraform, or actually that'd be the only way, because if you wanted to fix it the other way, you just redeploy your Terraform, right? And it wipes out the
Right.
drift. Yeah,
Right. Okay. Very good. Thank you so much.
absolutely.
Did we have any other questions that folks want to get out there today? I see, Harvey, I see you asked, do you have any resources lists that you can recommend? I'm not sure if I know specifically what kind of list you were asking for there, though.
Yeah, I can look and see if there's any good resources. I'd say that like Gartner and Forrester, you know, mixed results with some of the think tanks, right? But they have some really good resources talking about like I gave you that list of what you should look for in a CSPM when you're looking at a solution, or some ideas, not everything you should look for, but they frequently have good articles, blog posts, talking particularly about the evolution of tools, what other companies are doing, who the leaders are, right, in the spaces, and what they're good at and not good at, that would help you decide what tools. So I would look to like the Gartners and the Forresters and things like that for some initial resources.
Gotcha. List of products. My brain wasn't cluing in on that.
Yeah.
And Brian has his hand up. Brian?
Hey, Kyle, great session.
Hey,
This
thank you.
this is more of a thought leadership question, so just want to get
Mhm.
your feedback. So, you know, as more and more cloud providers, you know, recently Google and AWS both announced like dropping of egress data, you know, transfer fees, right?
Mhm.
You know, do you see any interesting potential trends in the CSPM space? You know, as companies really start thinking, you know, well, it's now more cost efficient and viable to do not just multi-cloud, but you know, true hybrid workloads with
Mhm.
on-prem plus multiple clouds. You know, just curious your thoughts on that.
So the question is, what part do I think CSPMs are going to be playing in that trend of being able to be more multi-cloud and potentially
Yeah,
combined with on-prem?
yeah, you know, just the threat vector becomes so much bigger when you're not just in one cloud, right? You're
Mhm.
distributing, you're transferring. So
Yeah.
just curious your thoughts on kind of, you know, how you see that
Yeah.
kind of going with
Yeah,
CSPMs.
that's a great question. So one of the benefits of CSPMs and more broadly CNAPPs is that they support multiple clouds. So you can apply those same security controls across multiple clouds using one tool versus, well, I'm doing it this way in AWS, this way in Microsoft, this way in GCP. So it gives you kind of that, and that exists today, that consolidated playing field. But as customers are using um, multiple clouds, and actually, I'll share Palo Alto, and I think it's public knowledge, Prisma Cloud, the product itself is hosted in both AWS and GCP. Different pieces of the product are hosted across that. So even Palo Alto, where we're eating our own dog food, of using multiple clouds, there is a lot of data transfer, right? To manage a CNAPP across two clouds. So yeah, I think there's a growing need, and you're also seeing, like I mentioned, CSPMs do net flow analysis, so they're looking at that traffic, and they can actually see that traffic flowing between AWS, GCP, and even on-prem. I see a lot of customers using hybrid workloads, so they've got big container clusters on-prem for some applications that talk to some container clusters, and some products scale very well across those hybrid workloads as well. So if that's a case that your company is in or is going to be moving to, look for tools that can support that, because some CNAPP and CSPM solutions can support those hybrid workloads and kind of that multi-cloud monitoring. So yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
We have one more in the chat, but if at any point we're exceeding your time threshold,
No,
do
I'm
let
good.
us know.
Yeah, I enjoy this.
Let's see. Harvey asked, he was referencing that he heard in passing, or I think saw you reference incident reporting and how
Mhm.
CSPM tool could play there. So in that
Yeah.
context, he asked, where would you look to accomplish incident analysis and then reporting? I assume leveraging the data and insights from the tool set.
Yeah, so CSPMs are going to be looking at your user audit logs, your net flow traffic analysis to look for those potential security incidents versus like a misconfiguration, right? So a security incident is an event that occurred that is possibly a threat actor, right? Not all of them end up being an actual threat, but CSPM tools are good at detecting some of those. So you can use the tool to manage those incidents, but here's what I would say there is, please integrate them with your SIM, right? CSPMs and CNAPPs, again, I hate it when a tool tries to be too many things. So like reporting, for example, reporting is a pretty solved problem. There is no reason for a CSPM tool to become a giant customizable reporting engine. Likewise, while CSPMs are one way to detect certain types of threats, as is cloud workload protection, they're not in the business to become a SIM or become a SOAR. So your best, most powerful use case is to use the CSPM and the CNAPP, what they're good at, what they're built for, and then send those incidents off to like your SOAR tool. So for example, it might hit a playbook if you have a cloud workload protection incident where it sees malware on an EC2 instance. That SOAR tool takes the incident, then it augments it. It goes and it pulls all this extra data, maybe from the CSPM, maybe from AWS itself, extra data about the EC2 instance. It grabs some forensic data. It does a geolocation lookup on the IP and looks in a threat database to give you data about that. And then it puts that enriched incident in front of a SOC analyst to go take a look and say, is this a real thing? Do I click the button on, I need to go contain that EC2 instance, grab a snapshot for forensics and isolate it, right? So use the SOAR tools, what they're for, in your SIM tools, right? And use the CSPM and the CNAPPs for what they're good at. And it can be a very beautiful thing when they're put together in the right way.